They stepped onto his land at first light, and by sundown, Elias Crow would no longer be sure whose land it was. The wind came down hard off the ridge, dragging dust and pine scent across the slope like a warning that never needed words, and Elias stood in the doorway of his cabin with his rifle resting easy in his hands, not raised, not lowered, just there, like it had always been, like it belonged more than he did, and for 12 years nothing had crossed that invisible line without his say-so, not man, not beast, not even the kind of trouble that usually found men who chose to live alone, but this. Morning was different because there they were, two figures cutting through the pale morning light about 40 yards out, moving slow, steady, not hiding, not calling out, just walking like they already knew where they were going. And that was wrong in a way Elias could feel in his bones before he could explain it in his mind, because no one wandered this high unless they had a reason or they had nowhere else left to go. And neither kind ever arrived this quiet. He stepped forward onto the worn wooden boards of the porch, boots creaking under his weight, and the mountain seemed to hold its breath with him, the kind of silence that comes before something shifts, something small but permanent. "You're on my land," he called out, voice low but carrying across the open stretch between them, and the words hung there, caught in the cold air like they were deciding whether to land or not. "Don't move," he added, and that was the part that usually worked, the part that drew the line clear. Enough for any man with sense to understand. But these weren't men, and they didn't stop. Not right away. The taller one slowed, her dark hair pulled back tight, her posture straight in a way that spoke of strength without effort, while the other, younger, took one more step before her foot slipped just slightly against the loose gravel. Not enough to fall, but enough for Elias to notice the difference between them, the imbalance, the strain. And then he saw it, the way her hand pressed lightly against her side, the way her breathing came just a touch too fast for someone simply walking uphill, and still, neither of them reached for anything, no weapon, no sign of threat, just eyes locked forward, steady, unafraid, like they had already weighed whatever came next and found it acceptable. "I said, don't move," Elias repeated, this time lifting the rifle just enough to make the meaning clearer, not aiming, not yet, just reminding the world that this place answered to him, or at least it had until this moment. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint smell of leather and something else, something older, something he hadn't noticed in years, and the taller woman finally spoke, her voice calm, measured, not loud, but it didn't need to be. "We're not here for your land," she said, and there was no challenge in it, no apology either, just a statement laid down like a stone, and Elias felt something tighten in his chest at the way she said it, like land wasn't something you owned, just something you passed through. "Then you're here for the wrong place," he answered. But even as the words left his mouth, his eyes had already drifted, just for a second, to the younger one again, because she was swaying now, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And Elias had spent too many years alone not to notice the small things, the shifts that told you what was about to happen before it did. "Sana," the taller one said quietly, not taking her eyes off Elias. But the name alone carried enough weight to make the girl straighten, try to hold herself together. And that's when it broke, not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, involuntary sound, a breath catching where it shouldn't, and a dark stain spreading slow against the pale fabric at her side. And Elias didn't move, not yet, because moving meant choosing, and choosing meant letting something in that he had spent 12 years keeping out. The mountain didn't forgive hesitation, but it also didn't forgive mistakes. And right now he couldn't tell which one this would be. The younger one's knees dipped, just slightly before she caught herself, her hand tightening, her jaw setting like she refused to let gravity win, and the taller one stepped just a half pace closer to her, not shielding, not hiding. Just there, present, steady as stone, and Elias realized something then that didn't sit right with him. They weren't afraid of him. Not the way people usually were when they found themselves staring at a man with a rifle on a mountain where no one else lived. They were measuring him, the same way he was measuring them. And that wasn't how this was supposed to go. "You should turn around," he said. But the words lacked the edge they had a moment ago, like something inside him had already shifted. "Without asking permission, we can't," the taller one replied, simple, final, and behind her words, faint but growing, came a sound Elias hadn't expected this early in the day, Hoofbeats, distant, maybe a mile out, maybe less, and moving fast, one horse at first, then another, then more, the rhythm building in that quiet, relentless way that meant they weren't wandering, they were tracking. And Elias felt the weight of the rifle in his hands change, not heavier, not lighter, just different. Like it no longer belonged to the same story it had a minute ago. He glanced past the two women, toward the line of trees where the sound was coming from, then back at them. And for the first time since they stepped onto his land, he wondered not what they were doing here, but what was coming for them, and why it suddenly felt like it was coming for him too. The hoofbeats carried closer now, no longer a distant suggestion, but a steady rhythm pressing against the quiet like a second heartbeat beneath the mountain itself. And Elias Crow did not need to count them to know there were more than one rider, more than a passing traveler. This was purpose. This was direction. This was men who knew where they were going and why, and the kind of men who rode like that did not turn back easily. He lowered the rifle just a fraction, not in surrender, not in trust, but in calculation, because the problem in front of him had just become larger than the line he had drawn in the dirt. The younger woman, Sana, shifted again, her strength thinning in ways she could not fully hide, and the older one, Nayeli, placed a steady hand at her back, not to hold her up, but to remind her to stay standing, to stay present, to not give the mountain or the man watching them any reason to think she would fall. "They are tracking us," Nayeli said, her voice still calm, but now there was something else beneath it, not fear, not urgency, something older, something that had already accepted what was coming. Elias glanced toward the tree line again, the sound of the horses now maybe half a mile out, closing the distance with the kind of pace that left no doubt, and he felt the weight of time shift. "Delay, you cannot stay out here," he said, the words coming slower than he intended, like they had to push through something to reach the air. Nayeli did not respond right away, her eyes studying him, not searching for kindness, not hoping for mercy, but measuring something deeper, something quieter. "If we come closer, you will not stop us," she said, and it was not a question. It was an understanding waiting to be confirmed or broken. Elias held her gaze for a long second, the wind pressing against his coat, the mountain holding its silence, the riders drawing nearer, and then he stepped back, just one step, enough to clear the doorway behind him, enough to make space where there had been none. "Move," he said, and this time the word carried something different, not a command, not a warning, but an opening, small, narrow, but real. Nayeli did not hesitate. She guided Sana forward, each step careful, controlled, the distance between them and the cabin closing in slow, deliberate movements. Elias watched them approach, his grip on the rifle steady but no longer central, because the story had already shifted away from it. Sana's breathing was shallow now, but she did not look at him, did not ask for anything. Her focus fixed on the ground ahead, on the act of continuing, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because it meant she had already decided what mattered, and he was not part of it. They reached the porch, the wood creaking softly under their weight, the familiar sound now carrying something unfamiliar with it. And as they passed him, close enough that he could see the faint lines of dust and sweat on their faces, close enough to catch the subtle scent of sage and leather again, Elias noticed the small object hanging at Nayeli's throat, a silver pendant, worn smooth at the edges, catching the light in a way that made his breath hitch before he could stop it. He did not speak, did not reach for it, but the recognition struck deep, quiet, undeniable, like a memory that had been waiting for the right moment to return. Nayeli paused just inside the doorway, turning her head slightly, not fully, just enough that her voice could reach him without effort. "Once we step inside, they will follow," she said, and there was no warning in it, no attempt to push him one way or the other, just truth laid out plain. Elias looked past her, toward the ridge, where the first shapes were beginning to break through the line of trees, distant but clear enough now to confirm what he already knew. This was no passing trouble. This was something that had chosen its path, and he was standing directly in it. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, against the wind, and for the first time in 12 years, the decision in front of him was not about survival, not about keeping his distance, but about what he was willing to stand beside. He stepped into the cabin after them and closed the door behind him, the wood settling into place with a dull, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and outside, the hoofbeats did not slow. The door settled into its frame with a dull weight that seemed to press the air thinner inside the cabin. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because every word now carried consequence. Elias Crow stood just inside, his back near the door, his eyes moving from the two women to the small space he had built to keep the world out. A table worn smooth by years of solitude. A cast iron stove still holding the last warmth from the morning fire. A single chair. Across from another that had never been used. And now that emptiness was gone, filled by presence he had not asked for and could not ignore. Sana's breathing grew uneven as she leaned slightly against the edge of the table, not collapsing, not asking, just allowing the wood to carry a fraction of her weight. Nayeli moved with quiet precision, guiding her without fuss, without panic, like she had done this before. Like survival had taught her that calm was stronger than fear. Elias watched them. In silence, the rifle still in his hand, but lowered now, forgotten in the shift that had taken place the moment he stepped aside outside. The hoofbeats approached the clearing, closer now, maybe less than 200 yards, the sound no longer softened by distance, but sharp, defined, each step of the horses, echoing through the ground beneath the cabin. And with it came another sound, quieter, but just as certain, voices carried faintly on the wind, too far to make out words, but close enough to confirm intent. These men were not passing through. They were arriving. Nayeli turned her head slightly toward the door, listening without moving, her posture unchanged, but her focus sharpened, and Elias noticed that even now, even with the riders nearly upon them, there was no rush in her movements. No. Us go. Elias let out a slow breath, the kind that comes before a man steps into something he cannot step back from. He glanced at the door, then back at the pendant at her throat, the silver catching the dim light, and something in his memory shifted again, clearer now, sharper, a fragment of a past he had buried deep enough to almost forget. Almost. The voice outside spoke again, a little closer this time. You do not want trouble, it said. This does not concern you. Elias finally moved. One step forward, then another, until he stood just a few feet from the door, his hand resting lightly against the wood, not opening it yet, just feeling its solid presence between him and the men outside, between the life he had built and the moment that threatened to change it. Everything concerns me when it stands on my porch, he replied, his voice steady, not raised, but carrying through the wood with a quiet certainty that did not need force behind it. There was a pause outside, not long, but long enough to suggest that the words had landed where they needed to, and then the voice returned, softer now, almost measured. Then step aside and let us handle what is ours. Elias closed his eyes for a brief second, not in doubt, but in recognition, because this was the moment, the one that would define everything that came after, the one he had avoided for 12 years by choosing silence, by choosing distance, by choosing to live where no one asked anything of him. And now the mountain had brought the question to his door anyway. He opened his eyes, and without turning back, without looking at Nayeli or Sana, he spoke. No. The word was simple, quiet, but it carried the full weight of the choice he had just made. Outside, the silence returned, heavier this time, like the world itself had paused to listen, and inside the cabin, something shifted, not in the air, not in the light, but in the space between three people who now shared something they had not shared. Before, a line crossed, a decision made, and a future that had just changed direction without asking permission. And if you have made it this far, watching this moment unfold, leave a comment and let me know what you think. And do not forget to like, because this is only the beginning of what is about to happen. The silence after his answer did not break. It deepened, stretching across the clearing like something alive, something listening, and Elias Crow kept his hand against the door, feeling the faint vibration of movement outside, boots shifting in dirt, leather settling, men adjusting their weight without speaking, the kind of quiet that meant they were thinking, not leaving, and that was worse. Because thinking men did not walk away from unfinished business, they reshaped it. You do not understand, the voice outside said again, calmer now, almost patient, as if explaining something simple to someone stubborn. Those women carry something that does not belong to them. Elias did not answer right away. his eyes drifting for a brief second toward Naeli, toward the small silver pendant resting against her chest, catching the dim light from the window. And there it was again, that pull, that memory pressing harder now. Not a full picture yet, just fragments, a voice from long ago. A hand placing something into another hand. A promise made in a language he had not understood at the time, but had never fully forgotten. Everything belongs to someone, Elias said finally, his voice low, steady, not challenging, just placing a truth where it could not be ignored. Outside, there was a faint shift, not movement forward, but a change in the air, like the men had not expected that answer, like it had not fit into the path they had already chosen. Step outside, the voice said. After a moment, we will speak where all can see. Elias let his hand fall from the door, not opening it yet, just letting it rest at his side, and for a brief second, the weight of what he had done settled fully into him. Not heavy, not light, just certain. There would be no quiet return to the life he had before this morning. No simple closing of the door to keep the world out. That door had already been opened, even if it still stood closed in front of him. Behind him, Sana shifted again. The faint scrape of her boot against the wooden floor, and Elias glanced back, just long enough to see that. She was still standing, still holding herself together with a kind of quiet resolve that did not ask for attention. Naeli's hand rested near her, not touching now, but ready, always ready, and Elias realized something then that he had not fully seen before. They were not waiting for him to save them. They were waiting to see what he would do with the choice he had already made, and that changed everything. He turned back to the door and reached for the handle, the metal cold against his palm. The kind of cold that wakes a man up, brings him fully into the moment whether he wants to be there or not. He opened it slowly, not in defiance, not in fear, just an acceptance of what stood on the other side. The light outside seemed sharper now, cutting through the dim interior, and the men came into view, 5 of them, mounted, spaced just enough to hold the ground without crowding it, their horses steady, their posture controlled, not aggressive, not relaxed, just certain. The one who had been speaking sat slightly forward, his gaze fixed on Elias, measuring, weighing, the way men do when they are deciding how far something will go. You made a choice, the man said, his voice carrying easily across the short distance, and Elias stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close behind him without looking back. I did, he replied. Simple, nothing added, nothing taken away. The wind moved again, brushing across the clearing, lifting dust, carrying the faint scent of pine and leather, and for a moment, it felt like the mountain itself was watching, waiting to see which way the balance would shift. Then understand this. The rider continued, his tone still calm, but now edged with something firmer, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. We are not here for you. We are here for what they carry. Elias stood still, his boots planted on the worn boards of the porch, the place where he had spent years standing alone, and now it felt different. Beneath him, not because the wood had changed, but because he had. And if I say no? He asked, not out of challenge, but out of clarity. The man studied him for a moment, then answered without hesitation, then, you stand between us and it. Elias nodded once, slow, deliberate, like a man acknowledging the shape of the path ahead, not resisting it, not welcoming it, just seeing it clearly for what it was. He did not reach for his rifle, did not shift his stance. He simply stood, and in that stillness there was something that the riders had not expected, not defiance, not fear, but a kind of quiet presence that did not bend, the kind that could not be pushed aside because it was not trying to push back. It was simply there, and for a brief moment, something in the air shifted again, subtle, but real, like the line between what was about to happen and what could still be avoided had become thinner than any of them realized. Behind Elias, inside the cabin, Naeli stood just out of sight, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, her eyes closed for a brief second, as if listening to something beyond the voices, beyond the wind, something older, something that did not belong to the men outside or the man on the porch, something that had been set in motion long before any of them arrived here. And when she opened her eyes again, there was a quiet understanding in them, not of what would happen next, but of what had already been decided. And out on the porch, Elias Crow stood between 2 worlds that no longer seemed separate, and for the first time in years, He did not feel like he was standing on his land alone. The wind shifted again, slower this time, as if even the mountain itself was waiting to see which way the moment would turn, and Elias Crow did not move from where he stood on the porch, not forward, not back, just present, his shadow stretching long across the worn boards behind him, touching the door he had closed and the space he had chosen to protect without fully understanding why. The rider in front studied him with a patience that did not feel like kindness, more like calculation, like a man measuring distance without needing to step closer. "You do not look like a man who wants trouble," he said, and the words carried no insult, only observation. Elias let out a quiet breath, his eyes steady. "I do not," he replied, and that was the truth, simple, unguarded, the kind of truth that did not try to hide behind pride. "Then do not make this harder than it needs to be," the rider continued, his hand resting loosely on the saddle horn, relaxed in a way that suggested control, not ease. "Those women are passing through your life, nothing more, but what they carry will stay, and it will bring more men than us." Elias listened without interrupting, because there was something in the way the man spoke that felt practiced. Like he had said these words before in different places to different men who had stood exactly where Elias stood now, and maybe some of them had stepped aside, maybe some had not, but the path always ended the same way. The rider shifted slightly in the saddle, the leather creaking softly. "You live alone," he added, glancing briefly at the cabin behind Elias. "That tells me you understand how to survive, so understand this. Survival means knowing when something is not yours to carry." Elias's gaze flickered for just a second toward the horizon, toward the line where sky met mountain, and then back again, because the words had weight, not because they were wrong, but because they were close enough to truth to be dangerous. "And what if it is not yours either?" Elias asked, his voice calm, not challenging, just placing another piece onto the board. The rider's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Everything belongs to someone," he said, echoing Elias's own words from moments before. But this time there was a difference. This time it sounded like ownership, not reflection, and that difference settled into Elias like a quiet realization. Behind him, inside the cabin, the faint sound of movement reached his ears, a shift of weight, a breath drawn carefully, and he knew without turning that Sana was still standing, still holding herself upright with a strength that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with necessity. Nayeli remained silent, but her presence carried through the wall like a steady line, unbroken, unchanged. The rider's voice came again, softer now, almost reasonable. "We will not stay long," he said. "We take what we came for, and we leave. Your mountain remains yours." Elias almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it revealed something the man did not fully see. The mountain had never been his, not in the way the rider meant, not in the way anyone could claim it with words. It had simply allowed him to stay, and now it was asking something in return. "You speak like this place answers to you," Elias said quietly, and for the first time, a faint crease appeared at the edge of the rider's calm, not anger, not yet, but awareness that the conversation had shifted somewhere he had not planned. "No," the rider replied, his tone tightening just slightly. "I speak like a man who knows how these things end." Elias nodded slowly, because that part he understood. Endings had a way of finding their shape long before the final moment arrived, and this one had been forming since the first step crossed his land that morning. The wind carried a faint sound from farther down the ridge, distant, almost lost beneath the stillness. Another set of hoofbeats, faint, not part of the group in front of him, something else moving through the mountain, and the rider heard it too, his head turning just a fraction, his focus shifting for the first time. Just enough to reveal that control was not as complete as it seemed. Elias caught that moment, small, but real, and something inside him settled into place. Not confidence, not certainty, just a quiet alignment with the choice he had already made. "You should go," Elias said, his voice even, not raised, not forced, just present. The rider looked back at him, studying him again, longer this time, as if searching for something that might still change, but finding nothing that would. The other men remained still, their silence now heavier, more uncertain, like they were waiting for a direction that had not yet been given. The mountain held its breath again, and in that space, between what had been said and what would follow. Elias Crow stood exactly where he needed to be, not because he had planned it, not because he had chosen it long ago, but because the moment had shaped him into it. And for the first time since the two women stepped onto his land, the line between them and him no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like something shared, something that could not be separated again without leaving a mark that would not fade. The second set of hoofbeats did not rush in. They lingered at the edge of hearing, like a question that refused to be answered too quickly, and Elias Crow caught the shift before any of the men in front of him did, not because he was sharper, but because he had lived long enough in this place to understand how the mountain spoke when something new entered its breath. The rider in front straightened slightly in his saddle, his attention pulling away for a fraction of a second, just enough to confirm what Elias already knew. This moment was no longer theirs alone. Something else was coming, something that did not belong to either side of the line drawn on that porch. "You hear that?" Elias said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a warning, just as truth placed where it could not be ignored. The rider did not answer immediately, but his eyes moved, scanning the ridge beyond the cabin, calculating distance, direction, time, and for the first time since he arrived, the calm he carried showed a small fracture, not fear, but awareness that control had slipped. "Just a little more of yours," one of the men behind him muttered, low, uncertain, and Elias almost shook his head at that, because the mountain did not work that way. It did not belong to any one group long enough to claim it without consequence. "Not mine," Elias said, still calm, still standing where he had chosen to stand. "Not yours either." The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound closer, still not rushing, still not urgent, but steady, like footsteps that knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to hurry. And that unsettled the men more than anything else, because urgency they understood, but patience like that came from something else, something that did not need to prove itself. Behind Elias, inside the cabin, Nayeli moved closer to the door, her presence now just a few feet behind him, and he could feel it without turning, a quiet strength, not pressing, not asking, just there. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but it carried through him like a steady line. "They are not with us," she said, and there was no confusion in it, no uncertainty, just recognition. Elias nodded once, barely, because he had already reached the same conclusion. The rider in front looked back at him, sharper now, the patience thinning at the edges. "You brought more trouble than you understand," he said, and this time the words carried weight, not persuasion, not strategy, just a man trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. Elias did not argue, because there was nothing to argue about anymore. The situation had moved beyond explanation, beyond negotiation. It had entered that quiet space where decisions had already been made, and the only thing left was to see them through. The second group came into view then, not charging, not spreading out, just appearing along the ridge like figures placed there with purpose, fewer than the men in front, maybe 3, maybe 4, hard to tell through the shifting light. But their presence changed the shape of the clearing immediately, not because of numbers, but because of how they carried themselves, steady, grounded, like they were not arriving to take something, but to witness what had already begun. The first rider turned fully now, his attention divided, his certainty no longer complete, and Elias saw it clearly. The moment when a man realizes the ground beneath him is not as solid as he believed. Not falling, not breaking, just shifting enough to make every step uncertain. "You should leave," Elias said again, not louder, not stronger, just the same as before. But now the words carried something different, not suggestion, not warning, but a quiet finality that did not need to be explained. The rider looked at him for a long second, longer than before, as if searching for some sign that this could still be turned, still be reshaped into something easier. But there was nothing in Elias to offer that, nothing left to give except the choice he had already made. Behind him, Sana's breathing had steadied slightly, not healed, not restored, but anchored, like the storm inside her had found a place to rest for a moment. And Nayeli stood with her, her hand now lightly resting against the doorframe, not hiding, not stepping forward, just present, part of the space, part of the decision. The rider exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried the weight of a man recalculating everything he thought he controlled. And then, without another word, he shifted his horse, not retreating, not advancing, just turning enough to acknowledge the new reality in front of him. The other men followed his lead, small movements, controlled, but different now, less certain, more aware. The mountain held them all in that moment. 3 groups, none fully claiming it, none fully yielding. And in the center of it, Elias Crow stood on a porch that no longer belonged to the man he had been that morning. The wind moved through the clearing once more, softer now, carrying the tension away just enough to let something else take its place. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that this was not about land, not about possession, not about who had the right to stand where. It was about what a man chose to stand for when the world stopped asking and started watching, and Elias did not move, because he had already answered that question. And for those of you still here, listening to this story unfold, thank you for staying until this moment, because what comes next will not be louder, but it will be deeper. The mountain did not rush the moment forward. It held it there, stretched thin between 3 sides that no longer fit the story they had arrived with. And Elias Crow stood on the porch with the quiet understanding that nothing would return to the shape it had been before sunrise. The men on horseback shifted again, not retreating, not pressing, just adjusting to a ground that no longer answered the way they expected. And across the ridge, the second group remained still, their silhouettes steady against the pale sky, not advancing, not signaling, simply present in a way that carried more weight than movement ever could. The rider in front turned his head slightly, measuring that distance, then back to Elias, and something in his expression changed. Not softer, not harsher, but more honest, like a man who had run out of rehearsed words and was left only with what remained. "This is not about you," he said, quieter now, and the statement felt different this time, less like persuasion, more like a recognition he could not avoid. Elias let the words settle without answering, because he understood them now in a way he had not before, not as exclusion, but as truth that no longer mattered. Because once a man steps into a moment, it becomes about him whether he wants it or not. The wind moved through the clearing again, slower, carrying dust across the ground between them, and for a brief second, everything blurred just enough to make the distance feel uncertain, like the lines between them were no longer fixed. Inside the cabin, Nayeli stepped closer to the doorframe, her presence now fully aligned with the threshold, neither inside nor out, and Elias felt that without turning, felt the quiet weight of someone who had already accepted what this moment required. Sana's breathing had steadied further, still fragile, but no longer slipping, like the ground beneath her had found a way to hold, and Elias realized that whatever they carried, whatever had brought these men here, it was not something fragile, it was something that endured, something that moved through people instead of staying with them. The rider shifted again, then slowly swung one leg over, dismounting with a controlled motion that carried no threat, only intention. His boots touched the ground with a soft thud, and he took a few steps forward, not close enough to challenge, but close enough to stand on the same earth as Elias without the barrier of the horse between them. And that mattered, because now it was no longer distance speaking, it was men. "You stand here like this is your place," he said, his voice low, steady, and Elias met his gaze without hesitation. "It was," he answered, and the past tense hung there heavier than anything else that had been said, because it acknowledged something neither of them had named, that the ground beneath Elias had already shifted, already changed hands in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. The man studied him for a long moment, longer than before, and then his eyes moved, just slightly, toward the cabin, toward the unseen figures inside. And when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, not softer, but less certain of its own direction. "You do not know what you are protecting." Elias let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man stops trying to control the outcome and starts accepting the path. "No," he said, "but I know what I am not." The answer did not explain itself, did not need to, because it placed a boundary where one had not existed before, not a line in the dirt, but a line in a man, and that was harder to cross. The second group on the ridge shifted then, not forward, not back, but just enough to make their presence undeniable, and the man in front of Elias saw it, his shoulders tightening just slightly, his certainty thinning further. Because whatever he had expected this to be, it was no longer that. And in that realization, the space between all of them changed again. Less like a standoff, more like a question none of them had fully asked yet. Nayeli stepped forward then, just enough that her shadow crossed the threshold and touched the porch beside Elias. And for the first time, she spoke to the man directly, her voice calm, unforced, carrying across the short distance with a clarity that did not need volume. "It was never meant for you," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just a statement placed where it could not be ignored. The man's eyes moved to her, and for a brief second, something like recognition flickered there, not of her face, but of something deeper, something tied to what he had come for. And then it was gone, replaced by the same measured control he had carried from the beginning. But now it felt thinner, like it had been worn down by the moment itself. "Then it should not be here," he replied, and the words sounded more like a question than a conclusion. Elias felt the shift as it happened, small, quiet, but real. The moment had moved beyond taking and giving, beyond ownership and pursuit. It had become something else, something neither side fully understood, and in that space, the only thing that remained solid was the choice he had already made. He stepped forward then, just one step, enough to stand beside Nayeli, not in front of her, not behind, but next to her, and that single movement said more than any words he could have chosen. The man watched it, saw it clearly, and whatever decision he had been holding onto began to loosen, not falling apart, but changing shape. The wind passed through again, softer now, carrying away the last sharp edges of the standoff. And for a moment, just a moment, the mountain felt still, like it had reached the point it had been moving toward all along. And Elias Crow stood there, no longer alone on his porch, no longer certain of what belonged to him, but completely certain of where he stood. The space between them did not break, it deepened again, but this time it felt different, less like a line drawn in dust, and more like something older, something that had been waiting beneath all of them long before they arrived. And Elias Crow felt it settle into his chest with a quiet weight that did not press down but anchored him in place. The man in front of him did not move for several seconds, his gaze shifting from Elias to Nayeli, and then past them both, toward the ridge where the second group remained, still as stone. And for the first time since he had stepped onto this land, his attention did not return immediately, as if something in that distant presence held an answer he had not come prepared to face. The wind slowed again, brushing across the clearing with a softer hand, carrying the faint sound of leather and breath. And in that quiet, Nayeli reached up, her fingers closing gently around the silver pendant at her throat, not hiding it, not presenting it, just holding it as if acknowledging what it meant without needing to explain it. Elias noticed the movement without turning his head, the subtle shift in her posture, the way her hand rested there not out of fear, but out of recognition, and something in his memory finally broke through, not in pieces this time, but whole, clear, a moment from years ago when he had not yet come to this mountain, when he had still walked among others, when he had still believed that the world followed rules that made sense. He remembered a woman, not Nayeli, not Sana, but someone older, her voice steady, her eyes carrying the same calm that now stood beside him. He remembered being younger, uncertain, standing at the edge of something he did not understand, and he remembered the moment she had placed something into his hand, something small, something silver, and told him without words that not everything was meant to be kept. Some things were meant to be carried until they found their way back. The memory settled into him like a stone dropping into still water, and for a second, the present blurred with the past. The porch beneath his feet no longer felt like something he owned, but something he had been led to, something he had been waiting for without knowing it. "You see it now," Nayeli said quietly, not as a question, not as a statement, but as a recognition. And Elias exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something released, something he had held onto for longer than he realized. "I remember," he said, and the words felt different than anything he had spoken that day, because they did not belong to the moment alone. They belonged to something that had started long before it. The man in front of them watched this exchange with a growing stillness, his posture no longer as controlled as before, not because he had lost control, but because the situation had moved beyond the kind of control he understood. "That does not change what it is," he said, But the certainty in his voice had thinned, replaced by something closer to doubt, not of his purpose, but of the shape it had taken. Elias looked at him then, really looked, not at the man as an obstacle, not as a threat, but as someone standing on the edge of the same question he had just answered. Maybe it does, Elias replied, his voice calm, not pushing, not pulling, just placing the possibility where it could not be ignored. The second group on. The ridge shifted again, just enough to draw the eye, and this time one of them stepped forward a single pace, not approaching, not closing the distance, just making it clear that they were no longer only watching. They were part of this now, and that changed something in the air, something subtle but undeniable. The man on the ground followed that movement with his eyes, and when he looked back, the path he had been standing on no longer seemed as straight, as certain. "If you walk away now," Elias said, not as a demand, not as a command, but as an offering, "this ends here." The words settled into the space between them, simple, clear, carrying no hidden edge, and for a long moment, no one moved. The mountain held them there, the wind quiet, the ground steady beneath their feet, and then the man let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a decision finally reaches its end. He turned slightly, not fully away, but enough to signal something to the men behind him, a shift, a release, not defeat, not surrender, just a recognition that the path ahead no longer belonged to them. The others followed, small movements at first, reins adjusted, weight shifted, horses turning with quiet compliance, and the tension that had filled the clearing did not snap. It dissolved, slowly, like something that had been held too tight finally being allowed to rest. Elias did not move as they began to pull back, did not speak, did not watch them go with triumph or relief. He simply stood, because this had never been about winning, it had been about standing, and that had already been done. Nayeli lowered her hand from the pendant, the silver catching the light one last time before settling back against her chest, and beside Elias, her presence remained steady, unchanged, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. The second group on the ridge remained where they were, still, watching, and for a moment longer, the clearing held all three sides in quiet understanding before the space finally began to open again, the wind moving freely, the mountain breathing once more, and Elias Crow stood there, no longer holding on to the land as something that belonged to him, but as something he had been trusted to stand upon when it mattered most. The riders did not rush as they turned away, and that was the part Elias Crow noticed most, not the direction they chose, but the absence of urgency in it. Like men who understood that leaving did not mean losing, only that the ground beneath them no longer answered the same way. Their horses moved slow at first, hooves pressing softly into the dirt, then gradually finding a rhythm as they made their way back toward the ridge they had come from, and the sound of it faded not in silence, but in distance, stretching thinner with every step until it no longer held the weight it had before. Elias remained on the porch, his boots still planted where he had made his choice, his eyes following the last movement until it disappeared into the line of trees. And even then he did not move right away, because something in him understood that the moment was not finished, not yet. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open slowly, the wood shifting with a familiar sound that now carried a different meaning, and Nayeli stepped out onto the porch, her presence quiet, steady, the same as it had been from the moment she arrived. Sana followed a few seconds later, slower, but standing on her own, her breathing more even now, the strain no longer pulling her down the way it had before, and Elias felt that without turning, felt the shift in the air behind him. The weight of their presence no longer something that had entered his life without permission, but something that had become part of it. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like a man who had just set something down that he did not realize he had been carrying for years. The mountain around them seemed to breathe with him, the wind moving softer now, no longer sharp, no longer pressing, just passing through, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant earth. And for a moment, the silence returned to the clearing, but it was not the same silence as before. It was not empty. It was full, layered with everything that had just unfolded, everything that had shifted beneath their feet without leaving a mark anyone could see. "They will not come back today," Nayeli said quietly, her voice carrying across the porch without effort, and Elias nodded once, not because he trusted the certainty of it, but because he understood what she meant. This was not something that ended with one moment, but something that moved in waves. And this had only been the first. He turned then, finally, his eyes meeting hers fully for the first time since the tension had broken. And there was something different there now. Not distance, not suspicion, but recognition, not of who she was exactly, but of what she carried, and what it meant that she had brought it here. That pendant, he said, his voice quieter than before, as if the question had been waiting longer than the moment allowed. Nayeli's hand lifted again, resting lightly against the silver piece at her throat, and she held his gaze as she answered. It was never meant to stay in one place, she said, and Elias felt that settle into him the same way the memory had, not as information, but as something understood without needing to be explained. Sana stepped forward slightly, her movement slow but steady, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked directly at Elias, her eyes clear despite the exhaustion that still lingered behind them. You already carried it once, she said, her voice softer, but certain, and Elias frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in the way a man does when something he has always known suddenly shows itself in a new shape. I do not remember all of it, he admitted, and that was the truth, because memory did not always return in full. Sometimes it came in pieces and feelings, in moments that only made sense when they were placed back where they belonged. Nayeli nodded, as if that answer was expected. You were not meant to keep it, she said, only to hold it until the path crossed again. Elias looked past them then, toward the ridge where the second group had remained, but now the figures there were gone, not in retreat, not in disappearance, just no longer present, like they had never been part of the story in the way he first believed, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant this had never been about sides, never been about numbers. It had been about timing, about the moment when everything aligned just enough for something to return to where it belonged. He let out another slow breath, his shoulders easing in a way they had not done in years, and for the first time since he had built this place, the land around him did not feel like something he had claimed, but something that had accepted him, something that had allowed him to stand here when it mattered. Sana stepped back slightly, her weight shifting with more balance now, and the strain in her posture had softened, not gone, but no longer the center of her being. Nayeli lowered her hand from the pendant again, and for a moment, all three of them stood there in the quiet, not as strangers brought together by circumstance, but as something else, something not yet named, but already real. Elias glanced toward the horizon once more, the light shifting as the day moved forward, and he realized then that the life he had known, the one built on distance and silence, had not ended. It had simply changed direction, opened in a way he had not expected, and could not close again even if he tried. He turned back toward the cabin, the doorway now open behind them. No longer a barrier, but an invitation, and for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because stepping inside now would not be the same as it had been that morning. Nothing would be the same, and that was not something he feared anymore. It was something he finally understood. The doorway did not feel like an entrance anymore. It felt like a threshold that had been waiting for him to see it clearly, and Elias Crow stood there for a long second before stepping inside, not because he hesitated, but because he understood that once he crossed it again, the space he had built for silence would no longer belong to silence alone. The wood beneath his boots carried the same familiar creak, but the sound no longer echoed the same way. It settled differently, absorbed by the presence now filling the room. Nayeli followed just behind him, her movement quiet, measured, while Sana came in last, slower, but steady, and when the door closed again, it did not shut anything out. It simply marked the place where something had changed. The light through the small window stretched across the table, catching the worn grain of the wood, and for the first time in years, that table was not just a place for one. It held more, not in objects, but in meaning. Elias moved to the stove, not out of habit, but because it gave his hands something to do while his thoughts caught up with what his actions had already decided. He added a small piece of wood to the fire, the faint crackle filling the space with a quiet warmth that felt different now, shared instead of contained. Behind him, Nayeli helped Sana sit, her movements careful, but not urgent, and Sana lowered herself onto the chair across from the one Elias had always used, the same chair that had remained empty for 12 years, untouched. As if waiting for a moment no one could have predicted, Elias noticed that, and paused for a brief second, the smallest shift in his breath, because something about that image settled deeper than everything that had happened outside. Not the men, not the voices, but this, a chair finally used. A space no longer held in absence. "You built this to be alone," Nayeli said, softly, her eyes moving across the room, not judging, not questioning, just observing what had been. Elias nodded once, his gaze resting on the table. "It was easier that way," he answered, and the words felt true, but not complete, because ease had not meant peace. It had only meant distance. Sana rested her hands on the table, her breathing now steady enough that it no longer pulled the room with it. And she looked at the surface of the wood like she could read something there, something left behind by years of quiet. "Nothing stays empty forever," she said, her voice low, but certain, and Elias let that settle without answering, because he could feel the truth of it in the way the room held them now. Not crowded, not uncomfortable, just full in a way that made sense. The pendant at Nayeli's throat caught the light again, and this time Elias did not look away from it. He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, as if approaching something that had already accepted him long ago. "What happens to it now?" he asked, not because he expected a simple answer, but because the question itself had been waiting to be spoken. Nayeli looked at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carried a depth that made the room feel quieter. "It does not stay here," she said, and Elias nodded slightly, because he had already understood that part. "And it does not go back with those men," Sana added, her gaze lifting to meet his. And there was something steady in it now, something that had not been there when she first stepped onto his land, something that had been restored not by time, but by the moment itself. Elias exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without tension, without resistance. "Then it moves on," he said, and Nayeli inclined her head just slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition. "It always does," she replied. The wind brushed against the cabin walls again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of the mountain returning to itself. And for a moment, all three of them stood in that quiet understanding, not needing to fill it with more words, because what had been set in motion was no longer something they could control, only something they could walk with. Elias glanced once more at the chair Sana now occupied, then at the one across from her, and without thinking, he pulled it out slightly, the wood scraping softly against the floor, and he sat, not as a man returning to routine, but as someone stepping into a place that had changed with him. The table no longer divided space, it connected it, and across from him, Sana watched with a calm that did not ask for anything more than presence. Nayeli remained standing for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the pendant. Then she lowered herself into the remaining space beside the table, not claiming it, not taking it, just becoming part of it. The fire cracked softly in the background, the light shifting as the day moved forward, and Elias Crow realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by the life he had left behind, but by the one that had just begun, not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet decision made on a porch where the line between what was his and what was not had finally disappeared. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, the kind that does not demand attention but holds a room together without asking, and Elias Crow sat across from Sana with his hands resting on the table, not gripping, not tense, just there, as if learning again what it meant to share a space without guarding it. The light through the window had shifted slightly, stretching longer across the floor, touching the edge of Nayeli's boots, the curve of the table, the quiet line of Sana's fingers resting against the worn wood. And for a moment, nothing moved, not because there was nothing left to happen, but because everything that mattered had already begun. Elias glanced toward the window, the ridge beyond now empty, the shapes that had stood there gone without trace, and that absence carried more weight than their presence had, because it meant the mountain had closed one path without force, without noise, just by allowing something else to take its place. "They were not there for us," Elias said after a while, his voice low, more to himself than to them. Nayeli did not answer immediately, her gaze resting somewhere beyond the walls, as if following a line that did not stop at the cabin. "No," she said finally. "They were there because the path crossed here." Elias let that settle, because it fit in a way that nothing else had, Not a coincidence, not an accident, but a crossing, something that had been moving long before he chose to step aside on his porch. Sana shifted slightly in her chair, her shoulders easing, the strain in her posture now replaced by something quieter, steadier. And when she spoke, her voice carried a softness that did not come from weakness, but from clarity. "You think this is about the pendant," she said, her eyes lifting to meet his. "But it is not." Elias frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in the way a man does when a truth is placed just out of reach. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and the question did not carry impatience, only the need to understand what he had already stepped into. Nayeli looked at him then, fully, her eyes holding his without pressure, without expectation, just presence. "It is about where a man stands when he is not asked to stand at all," she said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, heavier than anything that had been spoken outside, because they did not point to an object, they pointed to him. Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the table for a second, following the lines in the wood like they might lead him somewhere. And in a way, they did, because those lines had been shaped over years of use, of waiting, of silence, and now they held something new, something that had not been there before. He looked back up, his eyes moving from Nayeli to Sana, and for the first time since the morning began, there was no distance left in that look, no space held back, only recognition, not of who they were in full, but of what they had brought into his life. "And now," he said quietly, "what happens next?" Sana's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something close to it, something that acknowledged the question without needing to answer it directly. "Next is not something you are given," she said. "It is something you walk into." Elias nodded slowly, because that felt right in a way he could not argue with. Outside, the wind brushed against the cabin again, carrying a different sound now, not hoofbeats, not voices, just the natural movement of the mountain returning to itself. And for a moment, he realized how much of his life had been built around avoiding that movement, around keeping everything still, controlled, untouched, and how quickly that had changed the moment he chose to let something in. Nayeli reached up once more, her fingers resting against the pendant, and this time, she unfastened it, the small clasp releasing with a soft click that seemed louder in the quiet room. She held it in her palm for a second, the silver catching the light. Then she placed it gently on the table between them, not offering it, not giving it, just placing it where it could be seen. "It does not belong to me," she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more meaning than any explanation could have. Elias looked at it, really looked, not as an object, but as something that had moved. Through time, through people, through choices, until it arrived here, at this table, in this moment, and he did not reach for it, not because he was unsure, but because he understood now that reaching for it would be the same as holding on to something that was never meant to stay. Sana watched him closely, her gaze steady, as if waiting to see if he would make the same choice again. And when he did not move, when he simply let the pendant rest where it was, something in her posture softened further, like a tension she had carried had finally eased. Nayeli inclined her head slightly, not in approval, not in gratitude, but in recognition of what had just been done without words. And in that quiet exchange, the purpose that had brought them together shifted again, no longer about carrying, no longer about returning, but about what remained after both had been completed. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on his knees now, his shoulders no longer held tight by the life he had been living before this day. And for the first time, the cabin did not feel like a place he had built to keep the world out. It felt like a place that could hold it, just enough, just when it needed to. And in that realization, something inside him settled into a calm he had not known he was missing. Not the silence he had chased for years, but something deeper, something that came from standing where he had stood and not stepping away when it would have been easier. And as the light continued to shift across the room, touching the pendant, the table, the three figures now sharing that space, Elias Crow understood that whatever path lay ahead would not be walked alone, not because he needed others, but because he had finally stopped pushing them away. The pendant rested on the table without weight, and yet it held the room together in a way Elias Crow could not explain. The fire behind him burned steady, the faint crackle rising and falling like a breath that did not belong to any one of them. and the light from the window shifted just enough to place a thin line across the silver surface. Not bright, not dim, just present, like everything else that had led to this moment. Elias did not reach for it, not because he feared what it meant, but because he understood now that meaning did not come from holding. It came from knowing when to let something remain where it chose to rest. Nayeli watched him without speaking, her eyes steady, not searching, not testing, simply witnessing, and Sana leaned back slightly in her chair, her shoulders no longer tight, her breath no longer carrying the quiet strain it had held when she first stepped onto the porch. The room felt different again, not because anything had been added or taken away, but because something had settled into place, something that did not need to move anymore. "It will not stay long," Nayeli said after a while, her voice soft, but certain, and Elias nodded, because he could feel that too, not as a prediction, but as a truth that did not need to be proven. "It was never meant to," he replied, and the words came easier now, not because he had grown used to the situation, but because he had stopped trying to shape it into something else. Outside, the wind moved across the mountain again, carrying no urgency, no trace of what had passed through earlier, just the natural rhythm of a place that had seen countless moments like this and would see countless more. And Elias realized then that what felt like a turning point to him was only a passing node in something much larger, something that did not measure itself by days or choices, but by the quiet alignment of moments when people stood where they needed to stand. Sana reached forward slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, not touching the pendant, just feeling the space around it. And there was something thoughtful in that movement, something that carried more understanding than words could hold. "You could have turned us away," she said, her voice low, not accusing, not praising, just stating what had been possible. Elias looked at her, then at Nayeli, then back at the pendant, and for a second, he let himself consider that version of the morning, the one where he stayed in the doorway, where he held the line, where the world remained outside and untouched, and he felt nothing in that thought, no relief, no regret, just distance, the kind he had lived with for too long. "I almost did," he admitted, and that was as close to the truth as he could get without turning it into something else. Nayeli inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the honesty in that. "But you did not," she said, and there was no weight in her words, no expectation attached, just recognition. Elias exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without resistance. "No," he said, "I did not." And in that simple exchange, something closed, not in loss, but in completion, like a door that had been open for years finally finding its frame. The light in the room shifted again, moving off the pendant and onto the table, onto their hands, onto the space between them, and for a moment, the silver piece seemed to fade into the background, not because it had lost its importance, but because it no longer needed to be the center of anything. Its purpose had already been fulfilled the moment it arrived here, the moment it was seen and not taken. Outside, a faint sound carried through the air, not hoofbeats, not voices, but something softer, distant, like a bird calling from the ridge, and it felt like a signal without intention, a quiet reminder that the world continued beyond this room, beyond this moment. Nayeli stood then, her movement smooth, unhurried, and she looked down at the pendant one last time, not with attachment, but with understanding. "It will move again," she said, and Elias nodded, because he did not need to ask where or how. Those questions belonged to a different way of thinking, one he had already left behind. Sana rose as well, slower, but without strain, her balance now fully her own, and she glanced at Elias with a look that held something quiet and steady, not gratitude, not obligation, just recognition of the space they had shared, the choice he had made, the line he had crossed. Elias remained seated for a second longer, letting the moment settle fully, not trying to hold on to it, not trying to push it forward, just allowing it to be what it was. And then he stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor, the sound familiar and new at the same time. And he looked at the two women, really looked, not as strangers who had passed through his life, but as part of something that had changed him in a way that could not be undone. "If it passes this way again," he said quietly, not knowing exactly why he spoke the words, only that they felt right. Nayeli met his gaze, her expression calm, unchanged, but her eyes carried something deeper, something that did not need to be named. "Then you will know where to stand," she replied, and Elias felt that settle into him like everything else had, not as instruction, but as understanding, the kind that does not fade when the moment ends. And as the three of them stood there, the room holding them in a quiet balance that no longer needed to prove itself, the mountain outside continued its steady breath, unchanged and yet somehow different, because the man who stood within it was no longer the same as the one who had woken that morning, and the path ahead, whatever shape it took, would carry that truth forward whether he followed it or not. The moment did not end with a sound. It ended with a stillness so complete that even the fire seemed to lower its voice. And Elias Crow stood there with the quiet understanding that nothing more needed to be said. Nayeli stepped toward the door first, not in haste, not in departure, but in the same measured way she had moved since the beginning, as if every step belonged to something larger than the ground beneath her. Sana followed, her movement no longer burdened, her breath no longer uneven, and when Elias reached for the door and opened it, the light outside did not rush in. It simply waited, soft, steady, like it had been there all along. The mountain stretched out before them, unchanged in shape, unchanged in silence. And yet it felt different because he was different. The wind brushed past them, carrying nothing now, no tension, no trace of what had come before, only the clean scent of pine and distance. Nayeli stepped onto the porch and paused, her eyes moving across the ridge as if marking something unseen, not a path, not a direction, just a place where the moment had been completed. Sana stepped beside her, her gaze following the same line, and for a brief second, the two of them stood in perfect stillness, not as travelers preparing to leave, but as something that had arrived exactly where it needed to. Elias remained just behind them, not holding the door, not standing guard, just present, and he felt it then, the absence of resistance, the absence of that quiet tension he had carried for years, the need to keep things separate, to keep distance where it did not belong. It was gone, not taken, not forced away, simply gone, like something that had served its purpose and no longer needed to remain. Nayeli turned slightly, her eyes meeting his one last time, and there was no farewell in that look, no ending, only a quiet recognition that what had been set in motion would continue whether they stood together or apart. Sana inclined her head just a fraction, the smallest acknowledgement, and then they stepped forward, off the porch, onto the same ground that had brought them here, their pace steady, unhurried, not looking back, not because they were leaving something behind, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. Elias watched them go, not with a sense of loss, not with the instinct to follow, but with a calm he had never known. The kind that does not come from knowing what happens next, but from understanding that it will come when it needs to. The distance between them grew slowly, their figures moving across the open stretch, then toward the trees, and the mountain accepted them the same way it had accepted everything before, without question, without judgment, just as part of its endless rhythm. Elias stood there until they disappeared from view, until the space they had occupied returned to stillness, and even then he did not move right away, because there was something in that emptiness that no longer felt empty, something that remained even after the figures were gone. He turned back toward the cabin then, the doorway opened behind him, the interior waiting, but no longer as a place of isolation. It felt different now, not smaller, not larger, just shared. Even in their absence, he stepped inside slowly, the wood beneath his boots familiar once more, and yet carrying a new weight, not heavy, just real. The table stood where it always had, the chair still slightly pulled back from where he had risen, and on the surface of the worn wood, the pendant remained, untouched, unmoved, exactly where Nayeli had placed it, and Elias stopped, just for a second, his gaze resting on it, not with desire, not with curiosity, but with understanding. He walked closer, each step quiet, deliberate, and when he reached the table, he did not pick it up, he did not move it. He simply placed his hand flat on the wood beside it, feeling the grain beneath his palm, feeling the steadiness of something that did not need to be claimed to be known. The fire behind him gave a soft crackle, the light through the window shifted once more, touching the silver surface for a brief second before moving on, and Elias exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like a final release. not of tension, but of something deeper, something that had held him in place for too long. He moved to the door again, not to close it, but to leave it as it was, open. And when he stepped back out onto the porch, the mountain greeted him the same way it always had. But this time, he did not feel like a man standing alone within it. He felt like someone who belonged to the moment when it mattered. And as the wind moved softly across the land, carrying nothing but itself, Elias Crow stood there without reaching for anything, without holding on to anything. And in that quiet, he finally understood that out here, justice does not need words. It does not need force. It only needs a man who knows where to stand and the strength to remain there when the world asks him to move. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.